Good morning, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Hawk Blogger Mornings. I am Brian Nemhauser. You can find me on Twitter and Instagram at Hawk Blogger. And it's a special day. It is a Monday. It is a Robert Mays Monday presented by Pagliacci Pizza, our good friends over at Pagliacci Pizza, who have been undoubtedly helping Seahawks fans get through this doldrums of the last three games with tons of comfort food and carbs and cheese. It's undoubted that that has been a frequent order for Seahawks fans. Robert, how are you doing today?
I'm doing okay. We're settling into the season. At the end of every weekly recap podcast, we always do a segment about what we learned from that day. And I think that what I learned from week 6 is a lot of these teams maybe are what we thought they were. And there's something comforting about that. After the first 2-3 weeks of the season where you really don't know what's real and what's not, and you're trying to kind of search through the trees. I feel like after last week, it's like, all right, the Ravens are really good, right? This Bears team we thought would be a playoff contender, they seemed like they might actually be one of those. The Lions are like one of the best teams in the league. So it feels like we're starting to get some clarity on how this is all going to go. And as somebody who has to live my life trying to figure out every single team at the same time, that's comforting. I appreciate that we're heading in that direction at least a little bit.
I'll admit you were on my mind yesterday as I was thinking, well, Robert's probably enjoying pizza for a totally different reason on his Sunday. The Bears have kind of found their sea legs and are now. Caleb Williams looks like the player I think people were hoping he would be when he started. How are Bears fans? I mean, I feel so genuinely happy for fan bases that have gone through a lot of trouble and travail when they start to see the pieces start to kind of come together.
Listen, it's been 6 games. The last 3 games that have looked significantly better have come against 3 of the worst defenses in the NFL. You could argue, according to some metrics like DVOA, they are the 3 worst defenses in the NFL. So I think that's important to keep in mind. But at the same time, I think it's really nice to see a young quarterback gaining confidence. And that's exactly what this feels like, where they're playing well against bad defenses. They're stacking up good reps. You're seeing him really own the operation at the line of scrimmage in a way we don't typically see with young quarterbacks. I think that they've done a really good job of tweaking some of the things on offense, whether that's having a first 15 script, which they didn't early in the season, trying out a new way to deploy the run game, what they're doing with DeAndre Swift. We've noticed kind of the weaknesses along the offensive line a little bit less than we did early on in the season. So just stacking up really good things, even if it gets against bad competition. I think that's very important when you're at this stage of the proceedings like the Bears are.
Yeah, and I think it matters how you win and how
Yes.
you lose. And one of the things that stood out for me as someone who's been curious about Caleb Williams, maybe even a little bit more skeptical than some, was how he would operate within structure. And I thought yesterday looked like the best he's looked all year within the structure of the offense. There wasn't as much improv to create the sustainable outcomes that they were getting in that game.
Absolutely. And I love watching him on some of like the quick game concepts they have where he's getting rid of the ball really fast. I mean, yesterday, those throws less than 2.5 seconds. I want to say he was like 12 of 13 on the day. And he really does have an impressive arm and an accurate arm in the shorter intermediate areas of the field. He's still finding himself pushing the ball down the field a little bit on a lot of those throws. He's looked pretty uncertain, even against Carolina, where a couple of them turned into touchdowns. I think that that's kind of the final stage of him throwing some of those balls with conviction. But if you look at what he was doing in the intermediate and underneath area yesterday, it's real growth already. And every single game for a rookie quarterback, I mean, he's played 6 games. It's like 15% of his total NFL output. So these data points are important. And it's really nice to see the arrow pointing definitively up as he keeps stacking up these games.
NFC North, we talked about this a few weeks ago, looking like the best division in the NFC. Nothing's changed there. The Lions, they look like the juggernaut. Do you agree? Like you asked me, actually, the one thing that really stuck with me over the last week wasn't just watching the Seahawks lose, which we'll talk about in a second. It was you asked me, spur of the moment, who's the best team in the NFC? And I said the Vikings. And I immediately regretted that because I thought the Lions were the best team going into the season. I thought the Lions were the best team, but they were on bye week, so I wasn't thinking about them. But the Lions came out again and just dominated. And unfortunately, awful injury to Aiden Hutchinson. Really sorry to see that. How How do you, as someone who's very close to that division, how do you separate the teams in that division?
It's really tough, man. I mean, I think that there's a lot to be excited about. And I feel like the Vikings obviously had the super hot start. I still think over the course of the season, there is a chance we're going to get to the end of the year like we expected and have more confidence in the Lions and the Packers than we do in the Vikings, simply because we have more confidence in the offense and the quarterbacks. I think that Kevin O'Connell and that staff has done an excellent job of bringing Sam Darnold along in the early part of this season. But you saw the way that he played against the Jets, and I think there's just going to be a little bit more volatility on their offense than there's going to be for the Lions and the Packers. You know, the Packers have one of the best offensive minds in football running that thing, and a quarterback who can really lift the players around him. I mean, what Matt LaFleur is doing and what Jordan Love is capable of, that offense looks like it's playing on 7-on-7 at times when they're going against bad defenses. And the Lions, I think you can make a really serious argument that them and probably Baltimore right now feel like the most complete offenses in the league. I mean, this is the final stage of this Detroit team. This was always supposed to be that way.
Mm-hmm.
When you have Ben Johnson, who should have gotten 2 head coaching jobs by now, and you have your entire arsenal of pieces, they've managed to keep everybody, and you can drop Jameson Williams into this. That was the idea. That was the ceiling for this Detroit team, is that we have all of the benefits of the last couple of years when you can run the ball on your own terms. They're incredibly efficient in the play action game. And now can you add one more gear by dropping a fully realized version of Williams into this? And the answer seems to be yes. Like, that's exactly what this thing feels like right now. So I'm not surprised at all to see them rolling, because I always felt like this version of the Lions offense specifically was on the table. Now it's just going to be a matter of figuring out what their defense is without Aiden Hutchinson.
Well, it seems like that offense is so good that they are like the apex predator who's just playing with their kill. Like,
yeah.
they're
especially yesterday
to Penei Sewell for, you know, potential hook and ladder touchdowns. They're calling you know, tackle eligible every single time just to make sure Dallas knows. It feels like that offense is dominant. And I don't know, Robert, we talked about, like, the NFL is lacking dominance this year. And if there's a place where it seems like it's residing right now, it does seem like that Detroit offense. And that Detroit defense, I think, is not that far behind in terms of how well they're playing this year relative to, you know, especially where they were last year. I'm not going to spend a bunch of time on Dallas, but I mean, how bad are things for Cowboys fans?
I think they're just a forgettable football team. I mean, I think that's where the Cowboys are right now, where they're just one of the also-rans that are probably not going to deserve the level of attention people are going to give them over the rest of this season. Like, you look what they did against the Ravens, that ends up being a 3-point game, but they're down by 3 touchdowns for most of that game. The Ravens are a much better team and asserted themselves as such in that game. And then the next really good team they play, they get embarrassed. Like, they get absolutely embarrassed. And I know that they had a couple defensive players out, but they're just not a good football team. They're not even close to an elite football team. And I think that the quicker we all, as a general football watching public, realize that, and we realize what sort of attention this team deserves, then I think we'll all be better off for it.
Do you think it's, do you assume that the Lions are going to make a move for a pass rusher and a decent one at that, given what's happened to them?
Not necessarily. I think that if you look at their history over the last few years, they've been really, really, really deliberate in how they've added pieces to this team and how they've been willing to let their own players develop. And I know it's a bad situation for them right now because they already lost Marcus Davenport. Now you lose Aiden Hutchinson. Now you have your 2 starting edge rushers out. And that John Kaminsky is a guy that got hurt early in the season for them. So they're really, really thin at that spot. But I still feel like a splashy move isn't necessarily something that fits their personality. They've always been willing to say, we're going to move our own pace. We're going to bring in guys that we think fit what we want to do. And we're going to give every opportunity possible to the young players on our roster and allow them to potentially take hold of them rather than cutting off those opportunities by bringing in someone from the outside. So there's a chance they do it just because they think their ceiling and they think their window is a little bit different this year than it was last year. But they're just not a team that is going to make a knee-jerk reaction like that, I don't think.
There's already been, even when the Seahawks were coming to town, I was listening to Lions media and fans. They were already talking about Hassan Reddick back then. Max Crosby's gaining steam now. Personally, I can't see Hassan Reddick being a guy that they bring into that room.
I would be very surprised.
That does not seem like a Dan Campbell. That does not seem like a Lions move to make. Crosby, I could definitely see, but it will be interesting. This feels like the type of team where you want to win. Like this is your window. So it'll be interesting to watch. And as a Seahawks fan, I got to say, I am rooting. The Lions are probably my second favorite rooting interest in the league right now, and I wish them the best, at least when they're not playing the Seahawks. But let's turn our attention to the Seahawks, Robert.
If we have to.
Obviously, I had to do it, folks. We are down. We are down in the Seahawks fan base. Robert, it was literally like a few weeks ago that I was talking to you and maybe Mike Sando as well on our Friday show about Baltimore fans bemoaning the fact that they let the wrong coach go, that they should have fired Harbaugh and they should have kept Mike McDonald. And here we are 3 weeks later, and Robert, there's a vocal minority of Seahawks fans that are already ready to let Mike McDonald walk. Like that's how quickly things have shifted among Seahawks fans. Talk to me about what you've seen so far, and I'll follow up with a little bit of a blame pie question after that.
I think that they're a team that is a little bit in transition, right? And we kind of knew that coming into the year. There are some weaknesses personnel-wise on that defense that they didn't really have a chance to address this offseason with the limited resources that they brought into the spring. And you see those show up. I think that we've seen some of the holes in the secondary. That's been an issue. We've seen some of the holes at linebacker. That's been an issue. Seen some of the questionable play at safety. They kind of made their own bed with that a little bit more than the other positions. Like they committed to Rayshon Jenkins, obviously committed to Julian Love. So that's something where maybe there's a little bit more panic going on with that position group specifically. And on the other side of the ball, I think we all knew that this offensive line could be a problem, and they've continued to be a problem. And so you have this idea of what this group can look like coming into the year where, all right, even if Abe Lucas can't play, but George Fant was solid for the Texans last year. If you're going to have a swing tackle, even an aging one, he's somebody that you can probably rely on. And that just hasn't been the case, obviously. He didn't play. Your right tackle is a consistent issue. It was a consistent issue for the entire game against the Niners. You had your moments on the interior. And I think the lack of protection and the lack of the ability to kind of assert yourself on the ground, especially on early downs, you just put yourself in consistently difficult situations. So I think in a lot of ways, they're probably a version of the Seahawks that we could have anticipated coming into the year. It's just that those weaknesses that we expected, they've been even more fatal than you probably would have hoped.
There's a lot of conversation about the first 3 weeks, like you haven't played anybody. And now I think the pretty straightforward explanation is after the last 3 games, okay, now you have, and we now know more about who you are.
Yeah.
How much of that, you get the high end of variance against the bad teams. How much of what we've seen over the last 3 games, 2 of which are against the 2 Super Bowl favorites from the NFC in Detroit, San Francisco on a Thursday night, and all of that happening over the course of 11 days, of which, if you look at statistically, teams that play away on a Monday night and come home on a Sunday, it's not a particularly welcoming set of scheduled challenges. So how much do you just say this last 3 games is who the Seahawks are versus there may be some other factors at play?
I think they're probably, it's not like they got blown out by the Niners last Thursday. That game was close into the fourth quarter, and you lose the turnover battle in pretty substantial fashion. And you're still within a score, right? Like that's still actually a game deep into the game. So I think that they're probably what we expected them to be, in the sense that they're not in the same league as the Lions and the Niners are, but they're still going to be competitive in the second tier of that NFC. I think that what the Giants have done defensively over the last couple of weeks and what they did against the Bengals last night, that should be encouraging for Seahawks fans, right? This is a unit that's consistently giving offenses problems, even an offense like Cincinnati's that was rolling, that looked like arguably the best offense in football. So I think that as we get more information about what the Giants are, we already know what the Lions and the Niners are. Maybe in retrospect, as you kind of try to keep perspective about what the last 3 weeks have been, the sky isn't necessarily falling, and it doesn't mean that the season is over for a team that looked pretty darn good over the first 3 weeks.
So as you kind of assess what things are going wrong with the Seahawks right now, there are people saying, hey, this looks like a poorly coached team. There's people that are saying, the personnel's not good. They've got 1-year guys that they just kind of threw in there that are stopgap. Some folks are blaming the general manager, John Schneider, for not addressing known positions and positions of need well. What's your kind of rough blame pie like for the Seahawks being right now toward the lower end of what I think people were hoping they would be? How much do you lay the blame at the feet of those different parts of the team?
It's a really good question. I think I try to give some grace to a staff that's coming into their first year, right? They're still figuring out who the pieces are. They're still figuring out who they want to be on each side of the ball, the best way to play. I mean, it's still very, very, very early for a new coaching staff and a new regime there. On the personnel side of it, I think that one of the things I was looking at this morning that was a little bit surprising to me is just the lack of flexibility they have even next year. I mean, like some of the contracts they've signed and some of the swings that they've taken, I think in retrospect, some of those don't look great, right? I mean, Leonard Williams is a fine player, but when you combine the contract that you gave Leonard Williams plus the 47th pick in the draft, that's a huge return for a guy that I don't think is consistently changing games, even if he's reliable. If you look at the contract that Draymond Jones got, like Draymond Jones is a fine player, but he's making like $25 million against the cap next year. So I think some of the swings that they've taken on the high end guys haven't necessarily turned into difference-making players. And then you combine that with some of the smaller bites they've had to take that just, and the returns are probably what you'd expect, right? Like, why is Laken Tomlinson worse than you expected him to be based on how the last couple of years with the Jets went? Is Jerome Baker or Tyrell Dotson, like, do we expect them to be difference makers at that spot on stopgap contracts? Like, what do we really think Trey Brown is? So I think it's just a combination of the guys that you're paying like stars, not necessarily changing the game like stars, and then some kind of middling returns with the smaller bets that they've made.
When you look at the coaching and you try to evaluate the coaching specifically, when you've obviously looked at what's going on, the light box situations and where they were succeeding or failing there in terms of stopping the run, their ability to make changes in game or between games. How much do, even though it's a new regime or a new staff, how well are you able to evaluate how the coaches are doing so far?
I can see them trying to figure out a different path forward on offense, right? They were trying to run the ball last week, even if it wasn't effective. And so I think that that's just going to be something that they have to fiddle with over the course of the year, right? It's like, how can we try to run the ball more efficiently and run the ball more often just to make things a little bit easier on the line of the quarterback, while also understanding we probably don't have the personnel to assert ourselves in that area. Like if you watch what they were trying to do on the ground, those guys in the interior, those aren't difference-making players. Like Stone Forsythe is not something you can rely on there. Farrell Brown is their blocking tight end right now. Like they're just not set up to play that way, but at the same time, you need to be able to do a little bit of that in the modern NFL. We talked about the Lions, look at the Ravens. Teams that can do both are the really good offenses in the league, even if you feel good about your pass catchers and your quarterback. So I think that it's going to be a process on that side of the ball. And I think it was always going to be based on where Ryan Grubb comes from. Like he can dial up some very cool stuff throwing the ball down the field, but how it was going to marry with the way that they run the ball, that was always going to be the biggest question. I still think that's a work in progress. On defense, I don't know what to make of it right now. Obviously, they've been super banged up. It just feels like there are a couple moments every single game where things short circuit a little bit, like the Debo touchdown and even that completion to George Kittle. Like, I just don't even understand what's supposed to be happening on either of those plays. And it was almost the same result with a similar sort of design from the Niners. So I still think that it's so early that it's hard to make definitive statements, but I'm a little bit surprised that it feels like the defense has kind of struggled to find itself based on what we saw from Mike McDonald last year.
Yeah, I'll admit, as we said, you and I talked about the light box run defense was an issue. I went and looked and did some research before this game, and in neutral box, just 7 defenders, not stacked, neutral box, the Seahawks were a top 5 run defense before this game. So it was really this light box issue. I talked to Mike McDonald about it. He smiled and appreciated the question. And then in this game, Robert, they actually did well in light box. They actually defended the run. I didn't know till yesterday. I went through every run play by personnel in the box, and they only allowed 4 yards per carry on those, but they did it a lot less. Neutral box, also not a problem. They did not, the explosives were not coming. So almost all of the running plays, neutral box, light box, were actually a clear improvement over where they've been against a very good run team. It was the stacked box in this game where you had a couple of major explosives that were the result of either poor angles, or in one case on the Jordan Mason run, you had Cam Young getting his first play and Mike Morris in at the same time, and they both just got blown off the ball like that. Cam Young literally played 2 snaps that game, and that was one of them. So like Mike McDonald's like, there's new problems, and I didn't believe him at first, but I think he might be right.
I think new problems is such a good way to frame it. It just seems like they're playing whack-a-mole every single week, where when they solve one thing, something else pops up. And maybe that isn't necessarily surprising, again, with a new staff that's dealt with some injuries, that doesn't have the best personnel on that side of the ball. But I have faith in their ability to solve some of this over the course of the season, right? I mean, this is always going to be a new challenge for somebody stepping into that role. He can't just spend all of his time figuring out how to fix the defense. It's a new staff, a lot of guys that he hasn't necessarily worked with before. So I just feel like the fact that they've been able to solve some of the issues that have cropped up, and then new issues have kind of sprouted up in their place, that does feel like they're being proactive enough to figure out what some of those issues look like, how to solve them, and then just having to go on to the next one. Like, again, those explosive plays in zone defense, like that was not an issue over the first couple weeks of the season, and now they are. So I just figure that over the course of the year, we're going to get a better understanding of what this actually looks like, and it's hard to say right now.
Yeah, it's one of the challenges. And we're talking to Robert Mays of the Athletic Football Show, brought to you by Pagliacci Pizza. When people talk about the coaching, like this is a poorly coached team, and then we talk about new problems, for me, it's hard to connect those two. Like if the coaches are having the same problems and they're not getting corrected, then I'm more likely to point a finger at the coaching staff. When you actually are seeing in the course of 4 days, a pretty significant change in the percentage of ways that they're trying to stop the run in terms of light box versus neutral, and the types of problems they're having, that feels like the coaching actually picked something and made an improvement. But yeah, it's now they get a long week to get ready for Atlanta, and we'll see if they're able to get things a little bit more straightened out for this one. We talk a lot about Geno Smith and our big love for Geno. This was a tough game for Geno Smith.
Rough Geno game.
Yeah, talk to me about what you saw from Geno Smith in this one.
I'd say a couple different things. I'd say one, he missed a couple throws he just doesn't typically miss. And I know that people are going to talk about the underthrow to DK Metcalf or the interceptions. The first interception, I mean, he's getting bent in half as he tries to throw that ball, which was a consistent problem throughout the game. The second interception to DK, like, I'm sure people have looked at the replay 1,000 different times. If you look at the all-22, the angle that DK takes on that dig and him taking it upfield, it makes it really difficult on the quarterback in that moment. So the interceptions aren't even necessarily the plays that I'm worried about, but he misses JSN on a crosser that just isn't a throw he typically misses on a third down in this game. And I also think that one of Geno's, the reason I love Geno, the reason I love watching Geno play is he's always trying to make the hardest throw in the field, and he's often able to make it. But at the same time, I think that he puts himself in some difficult situations at times with trying to fit those balls into tight windows. Mm-hmm. And if you look at a couple of the throws in this game, like the fade to DK in the back left corner of the end zone that's almost complete for a touchdown, he's got like a mesh concept in front of him to his right if he wants it, rather than taking the one-on-one. There's that play in traffic early in the first half where DK can't quite hold on to it as he throws it in between 3 defenders. It's going to be a really difficult catch, but one he still probably could have made. He's got something to his left side. So I feel like his desire to kind of push the envelope with some of these throws and try to fit these balls into tight windows, he's making things a little bit harder on him than it needs to be. And I think that comes with a certain level of volatility. And it felt like we got that last week, where some of those 50-50 balls, some of those really tight window throws that are going to go one way or the other and feel like a coin flip, it was coming up tails a lot last week when you want it to be coming up heads.
The quote underthrow to DK that I've seen so many people talk about. I mean, having been there and watched it happen, Nick Bosa was in Geno's lap. There's no ability to
The
step
entire
into
game.
that throw. And yeah, the entire game. And I'll tell you my reaction as a fan watching it. I was like, why is DK not adjusting to that ball? Why is he not slowing down and attacking that football and using his advantages of height and verticality to go make that play, as opposed to waiting for it to come to him and allowing a defensive back to get between him and the ball? Now, not everyone agrees with that, but the reason I bring that up is this was a game where Charvarius Ward was not playing. DK Metcalf is the most talented athlete, probably maybe on the field. And it felt like he was not a major factor in this game and was clowned and trolled by Lenore after it mercilessly. The Seahawks are going to have a decision to make on DK Metcalf, who also seems to be someone who doesn't really like to be criticized. I don't know how well he likes to be coached. What do you do? What do you do with someone that has this immense talent that may not ever choose to really realize it?
It's a really good question. And I think that he's a frustrating player in a lot of ways, because what he can do is a vertical explosive presence. He's one of the most explosive athletes in the NFL. And we've seen this over the first 4 or 5 weeks of the season. Like, what he's able to do on some of those double moves, adjusting routes in real time, the acceleration, it's a real presence within your offense. Like, you need something like that to create explosives in the modern NFL. The problem is that he just plays smaller than you want him to consistently. Like, he plays almost like not even an undersized, but like a normal size vertical receiver. I'm trying to think of a good example. He plays more like Terry McLaurin than he does like a T. Higgins or somebody else that's a big bodied player. And it makes him kind of a confusing watch. You're just trying to figure out what he's supposed to be within the context of the game. And it can be a little bit frustrating. So I've had this issue over the last few years. It's like, I don't really know what to make of him. Like, do you just sit there and say, we're fine with the strengths and what he provides the offense, and that's enough? Or do you fixate on where some of the gaps in his game are? I think it's probably unfair to do either one, but I don't know exactly where I land. And when you combine that with the Tyler Lockett, who's now in his 30s and is going to be making $30 million against the cap next year, you just have to make some decisions about what you want your roster construction to be. And I think that those are kind of difficult decisions.
If you're in that situation, what do you do?
I move on from Lockett next year, and I keep DK and understand what he is, right? And I think that it's funny because in the previous iteration of this team, where it was Lockett and DK as kind of the two main forces in the passing game, you really had two vertical players that weren't really contested catch guys, that weren't necessarily yak guys. And so there was kind of a sameness to them, even if physically they look very different. And so I think if I were trying to build this receiving core, I actually think the best collection of skill sets would be DK as like your vertical option. You have JSN as like a slot guy that's obviously going to be more of an intermediate presence for you. And I actually think going out and getting like more of a big bodied ball winner type player would be the best way to round out the group. And so I think that trying to find something like that, a presence like that within the offense heading into next year and potentially moving on from Lockett, I think that's the path that probably makes the most sense to me.
All right, Robert. I got to ask you, given that, well, a couple things. Do you have a couple minutes before I let
Absolutely.
you go?
Yeah, absolutely.
First thing I got to ask is not directly related to the Seahawks, but the 49ers. The Seahawks once again played a pretty poor game. They got uncharacteristically bad game from their quarterback, or some people would say characteristically when it comes against the 49ers. Geno has not had a good game against them yet. They struggled to defend the run again, had some of those issues that we talked about. They were down 23-3, and they still had the ball like a couple times with a chance to take the lead. I came away from that game feeling like the 49ers are not the team that they once were. Like, I want to know from you've been very steadfast in your belief that, hey, this team's going to be just fine. They're really good. Do you have that same opinion? Has any of that changed at all?
Not really, just because I think that there are a couple different things to consider, right? I think that if they do get McCaffrey back at some point this year, whether that's in week 10, week 11, they're going to be relevant enough where they're going to be in the mix before that happens. And then we get to see what his influence looks like within the offense. You're really seeing the issues where his presence matters, like down in the red zone and when the field shrinks and their ability to kind of stretch people horizontally with him as a receiver and them just pounding in touchdowns. That we haven't seen that really. They've struggled in the red zone in ways they haven't in years past. And the other thing that's really jumped out to me is just that how much teams are willing to play man coverage against them in ways they weren't in previous years. And I think some of that is what we saw in the Super Bowl. And we saw that, okay, if you really challenge these guys, this is not the way that they want to play. They want to sit in zone and let you pick them apart. It's exactly what happened to the Seahawks. I mean, if you look at Purdy's numbers against zone coverage in that game, he was an absolute monster. When they played man, he was 0 of 5. And so the Seahawks don't really have the horses to do that against the Niners in the way that some other teams do in the secondary. But that's what we've seen. Teams are playing like 70% man coverage against them on third down. And I think that they've struggled there because it's add a layer of volatility to the offense. So I think they're still figuring out who they want to be against this version of NFL defenses because teams are playing them in a way that they're playing no other offense in the league. One of the reasons that I feel good about what they'll look like on the other side is that I actually think that as teams have put more on Purdy with that style of defense, he's really answered the bell. I actually think he's played some really good football and has been a consistent lifter for them. So if they can kind of figure out what this kind of stop and start and like just sputtering version of the offense looks like, because this is a new way that teams are playing against them, I actually think that the quarterback playing at this level plus the component parts when everything is back together, I actually feel really good about what the end result might look like.
All right. Well, so we're going to look ahead quickly to the Falcons game coming up this Sunday. And I want you to decide, I'm going to give you a second, who needs to get a delivery of Pagliacci Pizza and feel good in order to win this game for the Seahawks? Who are the key players? And there's some new seasonal specials, so I'm going to give you some new things to think about here. This is what a beautiful picture that is. Butternut Sage Primo. And then there is also a Mushroom Primo as an option. I'll put that up here. That's a much nicer picture. So butternut sage or mushroom. And then you have got this pumpkin gelato as an option. So first of all, you got a couple choices. Who has to show up for the Seahawks to win this game in Atlanta? And which pizza are you sending?
It's the butternut squash one. I mean, it's anytime I can lean into the fall flavors. I'm a big fan of it. I'm built for this time of year. This is the first day it's been like chilly here in Chicago, and I'm just so happy. So anytime I can take advantage of the fall flavors over the course of the year, I want to do that. I will say, I think it's still going to be one of those front seven games. And I say that because the Falcons are just running the ball at an extremely efficient clip right now. Their offensive line is built to do it. They have two really good backs. I think that's really become part of the engine of that offense. They weren't doing it against the Bucs because the Bucs were selling out to stop it. I do not think that the Seahawks are going to be that extreme in how they try to solve Atlanta's defense. So I think that's part of it. And I also think that this is just a game where they need to be able to take advantage of Atlanta's lack of pass rush, right? Like the last couple games you played against a Seattle or New York Giants team with Dexter Lawrence, who's arguably the defensive player of the year right now. You play against Nick Bosa. Now you're playing against a team that really doesn't have one of those guys. And so I think that making sure you're taking advantage of that as often as possible, because those are not going to come around very often, where this Seattle offensive line is not at a matchup disadvantage against the team that they're playing against. You need to feast in those situations, and hopefully they'll be able to do that this week.
It's a great point, Robert. And I was surprised when I looked it up today. The Atlanta Falcons are dead last in the NFL in quarterback pressure rate. The Seahawks have faced, I think, the 1, 2, 7, 9, 11 in pressure rate. And some of that's because they faced the Seahawks offensive line. But a lot of it is because they faced some actually very good pass rushing teams. And so this is a potential respite from that. Going to be fascinating. Robert, thank you so much. And thanks to everybody over at Pagliacci Pizza for sponsoring and presenting Robert every week. Have a great rest of your week, Robert.
Appreciate it. Talk to you guys soon.
All right. That was Robert Mays. And as he told you, you can get this Mushroom Primo. Of course you want to get the Mushroom Primo. and over at Pagliacci Pizza, you can get exclusive deals to Pagliacci Pizza by just signing up. There's a link to in the description of the video for exclusive Pagliacci deals. You can get those right there. Just sign up. It's free, and I sign up for them. I get them. You should as well. I think you'll enjoy it. So yeah, some good stuff there from Robert, and I think that we've got a lot. We got a lot to kind of work through as Seahawks fans. And I'll tell you that if you have not watched the episode I did yesterday, episode 203, and it is a watch more than a listen episode, I went through most of the running plays the Seahawks defended in the 49ers game. And I didn't know what I was going to find out. I didn't know what I was going to see. I was braced for it to be very hard to watch. And what I found was, oh man, they actually, like, in standard run defense situations, did pretty well. There was really a couple of busts over the course of that game that just make it feel very different. And in general, when they were either light box or neutral box, they were not giving up significant chunks of yardage on the ground. So I left there feeling a little bit better about the hope, a little more hopeful, maybe I should say, about how the Seahawks run defense can play out this next week and beyond. And then the other piece there is there was some personnel stuff where it was very clear to me when they had Leonard Williams, Jaron Reed, and Jonathan Hankins on the field at the same time, the run defense was pretty darn good. When they had inserted like Cam Young, when they had, Mike Morris, when they had some of these other guys out there, it was a step back. And in some cases, a huge step back. Or when they went to 2 down linemen, also a step back. I don't think this team can defend the run with 2 down linemen. I'm just not sure that they have that in them as well. They did okay in some of the light box, so I will give them that. But I feel a lot less comfortable with that. So the reason I'm bringing that up is I think Byron Murphy's back this week, and I think that's a big deal. Not only do I think that means you get one of your higher quality defensive tackles back who's also very effective against the run, but you are going to get less snaps from some guys that have been particularly ineffective in those situations. And so that's a pretty big difference. And I do expect that he will come back this week. I think it's going to be a big factor. And I'm not one to say, I didn't go into that Lions game saying there's no way they can win because they're missing all these guys on defense. Of course it was a factor, but I still thought the Seahawks had an opportunity to win that one. Turns out they did, but they didn't. They didn't end up winning. In this case, I really feel like Byron Murphy is a pretty key cog for how this defense, like for the problems that are chronic on this defense, I think Byron Murphy is a key part of mitigating some of those problems. The other piece that nobody will guess, but it is the reality, is the Seahawks pass rush. The pressure is something that I think a lot of folks wanted to see more of and see it be more effective. As far as pressures go, the Seahawks had a ton against the 49ers. They had the second highest pressure rate in the NFL in week 6. They had a 50% pressure rate against the 49ers. Now, Brock Purdy was amazing at scrambling, avoiding, getting away, getting outside, making some big throws. So it felt like a little bit less than that. But the Seahawks, believe it or not, the Seahawks had a higher pressure rate than the 49ers by a decent rate. So what did we know about Mike McDonald coming in? We knew that he was especially effective at scheming up pressure. And I think some of the people that are criticizing him from a coaching perspective and a defensive perspective may not be paying attention to the fact that the Seahawks still, even right now, have the 7th highest pressure rate in the NFL while blitzing just make sure I got the right numbers here, while blitzing the 22nd most. So they are not creating these pressures by blitzing, but they are one of the highest pressure rate teams, while their first round pick, Byron Murphy, has been out for 3 weeks, while Boye Mafe, their top edge rusher, was out for multiple weeks, while Uchenna Nwosu has played nothing other than 20 snaps on the season. I think you got to acknowledge that the pressure that Mike Macdonald's been able to scheme up is actually pretty darn impressive given the situations they're going against. So even the Lions game, even the Lions game, they had 11 pressures in 19 dropbacks. So no, they aren't getting the kind of pressure that I think everybody would like to see, where you're seeing the quarterback overwhelmed often, but they are creating more pressure than I think fans are understanding or appreciating. So, this is a huge week. As far as the way the schedule is going to go this week, there's no Mike Macdonald press conference today, although there is practice and there is going to be some locker room time. I will head down to the VMAC and get a look-see at what's going on there, try to talk to a few guys. I may post some interviews. If they do get posted, they will be on patreon.com/hawkblogger. So make sure you sign up there to get access to all that. I also am doing a new segment that we will start probably tomorrow, where I will be playing some of your voicemails. And if you would like to leave a voicemail for me and or the show, you can do so by recording a voice memo on your phone. Just open up the voice recording app, whichever phone you got. Record a brief voice memo, 30 seconds or less, ideally. It doesn't have to be exactly 30 seconds, but the more concise, the better. And it can be on any topic, football or otherwise. You can pick your topics. If you want to have some fun, you want to talk about something non-football related, whatever. And I will play, not all, but I will play some of those voicemails on the show and either give you my reaction, my response, or my guests' reactions and responses. No telling when this will happen. It will be random throughout each show and each week, and it'll depend on the voicemails I get. So record on your voice memo app and then attach that to an email and send it to brian@hawkblogger.com, and I will pick from what is sent. So let's see. Like I said, practice later today. Tomorrow the team is off. Wednesday will be the first time we get to talk to the coach this week. So we won't get to hear, other than practice injury reports, we will not get to hear from coach about any players. We will not get to hear if there's any players like Abe Lucas or otherwise being starting their window to be activated. Is worth noting that Cameron Young was his practice window started just 1 week before he played in a game. And I think that is of note because actually, was it 2 weeks? Maybe it was 2 weeks. Let me double check that real quick. Cam Young practice window. Okay. October 3rd is when his practice window was opened. So that October 2nd. And then he played October 10th. So it was 1 week that he was allowed to practice. So the reason I bring that up is I've been under the assumption that they're going to give Abe Lucas a full 3 weeks after he's activated before his window, before they actually play him in a game. It could be that their philosophy is that they want to, they only need a week for guys to get back in there. Now, I happen to think an offensive lineman, they'd probably take a little bit longer. But if, for example, they do not activate Abe Lucas's practice window this week, then I was like, well, that could be 3 weeks. That could be post-bye. We have to kind of figure out when that would be. If it's actually that they would potentially play him 1 to 2 weeks after his window opens, then that reduces the concern. For me, like, I'd like to see if we can get Abe Lucas back before the 49ers game, which would be the week after the bye, week 11. And I think the team really needs it. So the other thing to pay attention to is that George Fant was placed on IR back on September 21st. He is eligible to return this week, I believe. Yes. Oh, he's eligible to return week 7. Yes. So that would be this week. Don't know if that's the case, but it's possible that George Fant could be back in action this week. It's also possible that Jason Peters, who's on the practice squad, could be available if they believe that he is an upgrade over Stone Forsythe. So there's a couple of potential options on the offensive line that could be helpful. Important to note as well, Anthony Bradford played almost all of the snaps against the 49ers. I have a feeling they've kind of made up their decision there. Now, they've said it, they haven't, but Christian Haynes only played 8 snaps in that game. So I think they kind of know what they are going to do there. I just think that Anthony Bradford hasn't been good enough to allow them to close the competition. And he was not particularly great in that game either. So we'll see. We'll see. Some things to watch there for sure. I will just let you all know. I mean, these are tough times, man. These are tough times when you're so optimistic and then things just take a really bad turn. And this was a really rough 3-game stretch. Things went almost worse than you could imagine. And you come out of it and you're like, ugh, how do I feel about this team? How do I feel about the direction? Is there hope? And I'll say this. I think that this team's ceiling has definitely dropped. I don't think there's any way to argue against that. It's a situation where when you're 3-0 and you're thinking you can actually go in and maybe win a game in Detroit against one of, if not the best team in the NFC, and you just can't stop them defensively, and then you see the same defensive problems or close to seemingly similar defensive problems crop up the next 2 games, especially that Giants game. It's really disappointing, and it feels like when you've got so many problems that it feels like whack-a-mole, those aren't generally situations where all of a sudden everything comes together and you're a great team. So I don't know that the Seahawks really have a realistic shot of getting up there at the 11-12 win mark, like maybe I think some folks were hoping to begin the year. What I do think matters is that they demonstrate the ability to stop the bleeding. And that starts with the run defense. I mean, almost nothing else matters until they can figure out the run defense. And offensively, Ryan Grubb, I think, is doing an okay job. I just think that this attempt at adding the run game last week was clumsy and predictable. And I think if you're going to take away what's been the most effective part of this offense, which has been the tempo passing that they've done, I think you got to be really smart about how and when you do it. And so I think they're still trying to figure out the right formula. And I think this offensive line is making it very, very tough to know which plays you can call, which things you can do reliably week in, week out. When you're going against Aiden Hutchinson and then Dexter Lawrence and Brian Burns and Kayvon Thibodeau, and then you're going against Nick Bosa, and they don't have the horses right now to really have enough confidence in that offensive line to dial up repeatable plays on offense. And so there's a lot that this team is having to figure out. And the number one thing that I want to see as a fan, I want to see that they have got the right people in that building, ideally inside that locker room, to really fix these problems and to play with energy and play with enthusiasm and love of the game that is infectious. Because right now it feels a little bit like a chore. And that's where things ended last year. And I think that the thing that needs to change this year is that you've got players who are demonstrating their love for the game through how they are coming together as a team, how they are holding each other accountable, how they are fixing these problems. That's not about wins and losses. It's going to have to translate that way. But the first thing is, like, are they bickering? Are they finger pointing? Or are they pulling together, and are they celebrating each other? And I think that's just a big, big question that I want to see answered over the next few weeks for sure. This is a chance. The Seahawks have a chance to win in Atlanta. That defense is not that good. We will talk about that more soon. If they can get that game, they get 2 home games and then a bye week. Granted, those 2 home games are not going to be easy. One's against Josh Allen and the Bills. The other is against the Rams, who will likely be getting much healthier by that point. But they are games that you have potential to win, and they are at home. So this is it. There's no, you blew whatever buffer you had by losing that game to the Giants at home. You've got to get this Atlanta game. You got to get it. We'll talk more about that game over the course of this week. Be sure you're out there. First look will be Wednesday. I'll go deep into the matchup on Wednesday. Tomorrow, we'll have Mike Randall back from FTN to talk about what the odds makers are saying, as well as any fantasy football questions you have. Until then, make sure you please give the show a like and click subscribe. Please make sure you support Pagliacci Pizza. Sign up for special deals. Click the link that's in the description of the video. And go on over to patreon.com/hawkblogger. Join up there. Support the show. Would love to have you there. The audio version of this show will be up there in just a moment. All right, everybody. I'm Brian Nemhauser. You can find me on Twitter and Instagram at hawkblogger. Thank you for tuning in to episode 204 of Hawk Blogger Mornings. Take care.